Imagine you're walking through a dense, ancient forest. The air is still, the light is fading, and the only sound is the crunch of leaves under your feet. Then you hear it, a whisper on the wind, a rustle in the canopy that doesn't sound like a normal animal. You look up and for a split second, you see a shadow with wings, a human-like form silhouetted against the dying sun. And then nothing. You turn to call out to your child who is just a few feet behind you. But the path is empty. They are gone. Vanished without a sound, without a trace. This wasn't a nightmare. For centuries in Japan, this was a terrifyingly real fear known as kamikakushi, being spirited away. And the culprit wasn't a man or a beast. It was something else entirely. A creature of the mountains, a goblin with the wings of a bird, and an unerringly human-like intelligence. They called it the Tengu. These weren't simple monsters lurking in the dark. They were a bizarre paradox, a contradiction that haunted the Japanese psyche for 1,000 years. On one hand, they were malevolent kidnappers, arsonists who laughed as villages burned, demons who possessed men and drove them to madness. They were said to be the vengeful ghosts of arrogant priests, cursed to roam the earth, filled with a bitter rage against humanity. But on the other hand, they were masters, unparalleled swordsmen who could defeat a dozen samurai without breaking a sweat. They were scholars of ancient magic, sages who held the secrets of the universe. They were the ones who, legend says, trained the single greatest warrior in Japanese history, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, teaching him skills so profound he seemed more than human. So what were they? Were they demons from the depths of hell? Or were they guardians of a sacred, ancient knowledge? Why would a creature that steals children also take the time to train a nation's greatest hero? This is the central mystery of the Tengu. And the answer reveals not just the story of a mythical monster, but the story of Japan itself, its fears, its ambitions, and its deep, spiritual connection to the wild, untamable mountains. To understand this creature, you have to look to the sky. The story doesn't begin in Japan, but in China, with the celestial omen of chaos and destruction. They called it the Tengu, the heavenly dog. This wasn't a goblin but a fiery dog-like meteor that tore across the night sky. Its appearance was a sign of impending war, disaster, and death. When this story crossed the sea to Japan in the 7th century, the name stuck, but the creature began to change, shaped by the island's unique landscape and beliefs. The Japanese already had their own spirits and monsters of the wilderness. They had the flying kite, the toby, a bird of prey known for its cunning. They looked at the Chinese heavenly dog, a bringer of celestial chaos, and merged it with their own terrestrial fears. The first Japanese Tengu weren't long-nosed men. They were terrifying bird-like horrors. Imagine a monstrous kite with the body of a man, sharp talons, and a powerful feathered beak. These were the original Tengu, pure primal forces of nature. They were the embodiment of the mountain's wrath. They started forest fires with the beat of their wings. They snatched people from mountain trails, and their cries sounded like thunder. They were a physical manifestation of everything that was dangerous and unknowable about the wilderness. For hundreds of years, this was the Tengu, a terrifying bestial demon to be feared and avoided. But then, a new religion began to sweep across Japan, and it would forever change the face of this monster. That religion was Buddhism. Buddhism brought with it complex ideas about karma, reincarnation, and the different realms of existence. One of these realms was the Yokai, a world of demons and monsters. Suddenly, the priests and scholars of Japan had a new box to put the Tengu in. They weren't just random nature spirits anymore. They were something far more specific and far more tragic. The new story went like this. A Buddhist priest who was powerful, learned, and respected, but who secretly harbored a fatal flaw: pride. He used his knowledge not for enlightenment, but for personal gain and glory. He was arrogant, vain, and his faith was corrupt. Because he was a priest, he couldn't fall into a traditional hell. But because of his pride, he couldn't achieve enlightenment and reach paradise. So upon death, he was reborn into a cursed, in-between state. He was reborn as a Tengu. This single idea changed everything. The Tengu was no longer just a dumb beast. It now possessed all the intelligence, knowledge, and memories of its former human life as a priest. It understood scripture, politics, and the complexities of the human heart. But all this knowledge was now twisted by an immortal, burning rage. They were consumed by jealousy for the humans they once were, and they hated the Buddhist faith they felt had failed them. This is the key to the paradox. This is why a Tengu could be both a destructive demon and a wise sage. Their priestly knowledge made them formidable teachers, but their demonic pride made them cruel and unpredictable tormentors. They would haunt the very temples they once served, leading devout monks astray, whispering lies and creating illusions to shatter their faith. They became the ultimate test of a true believer's resolve. As this new identity took hold, the Tengu themselves began to evolve. They split into two distinct classes, creating a social hierarchy in their hidden mountain kingdoms. At the bottom were the Karasu Tengu, the Crow Tengu. These were the throwbacks, the older, more bestial form. They retained the bird-like heads, sharp beaks, and feathered wings of the original monsters. They were the foot soldiers, the enforcers, the warrior class of the Tengu world. While still incredibly intelligent by human standards, they were driven more by instinct and aggression. They served the greater, more powerful Tengu as loyal servants and guards. To encounter a Karasu Tengu was to face a whirlwind of beak and talon, a fierce warrior who fought with a raw, animalistic fury. But ruling over them was a new, more powerful form, the form we all recognize today. This was the Konoha Tengu, or more famously, the Yamabushi Tengu. Their appearance was a direct mockery of the very people who now hunted them. The Yamabushi were human aesthetics, warrior monks who lived in solitude on the mountains, seeking enlightenment through grueling physical and spiritual training. The new, evolved Tengu stole their image. They appeared as tall, powerful men, but with one glaring, unnatural feature: a flushed, deep red face, contorted in a permanent expression of rage and arrogance. And of course, the impossibly long nose. In Japanese culture, a long nose is a symbol of pride and arrogance. So the Yamabushi Tengu wore its sin right on its face. These were the generals, the kings, the masterminds of the Tengu world. They carried the magical fans made from Japanese Aralia leaves, capable of creating hurricane-force winds with a single flick. They were the ones who possessed profound knowledge of swordsmanship, strategy, and magic. They were the ones who could shape-shift, teleport, and speak directly into the minds of men without ever opening their mouths. It was these powerful, long-nosed Tengu who began to see humanity not just as something to torment, but as a game to be played. They were like master chess players, and the feudal lords, samurai, and even emperors of Japan were their pawns. They were no longer content to simply haunt the forests. They were about to step out of the shadows and onto the battlefield, meddling in the affairs of mortals, and in doing so, forever altering the course of Japanese history. And they began with an emperor, a broken, defeated, and exiled emperor. His name was Sutoku, and in the year 1156 he lost everything. After a bitter and bloody power struggle known as the Hagen Rebellion, Sutoku was banished to a remote province, stripped of his title, and forced to live as a monk. In his exile, he found a strange sort of peace. He spent years meticulously copying sacred Buddhist sutras, pouring all his regret and hope for salvation into the ink. He wanted to offer them to the court in Kyoto, a final act of devotion to the faith he had once championed. But the court, fearing a hidden curse was woven into the pages, callously refused his gift. They sent the scrolls back. And in that moment, something inside the former emperor snapped. The rejection was the final humiliation. The story goes that in a fit of rage and despair, Sutoku bit his own tongue, using the blood as ink to write a new curse upon the scrolls. He swore an oath not to Buddha, but to the forces of darkness. He would become a great demon of Japan, he vowed, and he would drag the imperial family down into ruin. He would trade the emperor's throne for a throne in hell. He stopped cutting his hair, stopped trimming his nails, and let his resentment fester until he looked less like a man and more like a monster. When he finally died, legend says he did not find peace. He became an Onryo, a powerful, vengeful ghost, and some say he became something more. He became the king of the Tengu. Whether he literally transformed or simply became their greatest ally in the spirit world, the effect was the same. A dark pact had been sealed. The Tengu, these ancient spirits of pride and chaos, now had a royal mandate for mayhem. And Japan began to burn. The curse of Sutoku, amplified by the power of the Tengu, fell upon the land like a plague. The stable world of the imperial court began to crumble, and in its place a new violent era was born. The age of the samurai. The very warriors who had enforced the emperors will now turned on each other, carving up the country in a brutal civil war known as the Genpei War. It was a conflict that would define Japan for centuries, and the Tengu were right there, fanning the flames, whispering in the ears of ambitious warlords, and enjoying the magnificent chaos they had helped unleash. They were no longer just mountain boogeymen. They were kingmakers, pulling the strings of a nation tearing itself apart. And in the heart of this storm was a boy who would become the most famous warrior in all of Japanese history. His name was Minamoto no Yoshitsune. He was the ninth son of a defeated warlord, a child whose life was spared only on the condition that he be sent away to a monastery on Mount Kurama, north of Kyoto, to live out his days as a monk. He was supposed to be forgotten, a loose end snipped from the tapestry of power. But Yoshitsune was not built for a life of quiet contemplation. He was filled with a burning desire for revenge, a need to restore his family's honor and reclaim his birthright. But how? He was just one boy with no army and no training. He had nothing but rage and a name. Living on that sacred mountain, however, he was not alone. Mount Kurama was not just home to a monastery. It was known as the domain of one of the most powerful Tengu in existence. A Dai Tengu, a great Tengu whose name was Sojobo, the king of the Tengu of Mount Kurama. Sojobo was ancient, wise, and possessed a mastery of the martial arts that no mortal could ever hope to achieve. He was a creature of immense pride, a warrior monk who had seen empires rise and fall. And in this young fiery exile named Yoshitsune, he saw a perfect instrument, a tool to further plunge the human world into the delightful chaos he and his kind so enjoyed. So one night, as the story is told, Yoshitsune slipped out of the monastery and ventured deep into the cedar-forested valleys of the mountain. There, under the moonlight, he came face to face with the Tengu. Not the clumsy bird-like tricksters of old, but an army of warrior monks with long noses, fierce eyes, and an aura of immense power. And at their head was Sojobo himself. Yoshitsune, fearless, challenged him. He demanded that the Tengu king teach him the art of war. Sojobo was amused, but also impressed by the boy's audacity. He agreed, and so began one of the most legendary apprenticeships in folklore. Every night, Yoshitsune would sneak away to train with the Tengu. This was no ordinary sword practice. He was taught by supernatural beings. They taught him a style of swordsmanship so fast, so fluid, it seemed like a dance of death. They taught him to move with the silence of a forest shadow, to leap and bound through the trees as if he had wings himself. They didn't just teach him how to fight, they taught him strategy, deception, and the kind of battlefield tactics that seemed like black magic to mortal men. They were imparting to him their very nature, the cunning of a crow, the ferocity of a hawk, and the pride of a fallen god. 4 years this continued, until the boy had grown into a young man. His body honed into a living weapon and his mind filled with the Tengu's secret arts of war. When the time was right, he left Mount Kurama, a graduate of a school no other human had ever attended. He went to join his older brother, Yoritamo, to finally wage war against the rival Tara clan who had destroyed their family. And the results were spectacular. Yoshitsune was not just a good general, he was a force of nature. He led his armies with a brilliance that defied all convention. He pioneered tactics that no one had ever seen before. He led a cavalry charge down a sheer cliff face at the Battle of Ichinotani, appearing behind the enemy as if his men had dropped from the sky. He used the unpredictable tides to his advantage at the naval battle of Dan no Yura, a feat of strategic genius that utterly annihilated the Tara fleet and won the war. Victory after victory, his legend grew. His enemies whispered that he didn't fight like a man. They said he fought like a demon, and they were right. He was fighting with the knowledge of the Tengu. This was a major turning point not just for Japan but for the Tengu themselves. Their image began to shift dramatically in the public imagination. They were still dangerous, prideful, and chaotic. But now they were also seen as the ultimate masters of the martial arts. They were the keepers of secret divine knowledge. A samurai might pray to the gods for protection, but if he wanted to become an unbeatable swordsman, he might make a very different kind of offering in a secluded mountain shrine, hoping to attract the attention of a Tengu. They became patrons of the warrior class they had helped create. The long-nosed, red-faced Yamabushi Tengu, with his fan that could create gale force winds and his encyclopedic knowledge of combat, became an iconic figure. To be gifted by a Tengu was to be touched by greatness. But the gifts of the Tengu are never free. Their teachings are born of pride, arrogance, and a deep-seated contempt for the foolishness of mortals. They gave Yoshitsune the skills to win a war, to become the greatest military hero of his age. But they didn't teach him how to navigate the peace. They didn't teach him about human jealousy, political intrigue, or the paranoia of a brother who sees your success not as a victory for the family, but as a threat to his own power. The Tengu taught Yoshitsune how to be a perfect warrior. They never taught him how to be a politician. And that single fatal omission in his supernatural education would prove to be his undoing, leading to one of the most tragic betrayals in Japanese history. The Tengu had built their hero up, and now the human world was about to tear him down. Minamoto no Yoshitsune, the boy raised by mountain goblins, descended from Mount Kurama a changed man. He was no longer the frightened child sent to a monastery, but a living weapon, his every muscle honed by supernatural masters, his mind a razor-sharp encyclopedia of forgotten martial arts. He moved with a grace that was not entirely human, a predator's silence learned in the ancient forests. He possessed the strength to shatter bone and the speed to dodge arrows, but the Tengu, in their otherworldly wisdom, had overlooked the most dangerous battlefield of all, the human heart. They had taught him 1,000 ways to kill a man, but not a single way to read one. They had taught him the art of war, but not the art of politics. Carrying the name of his disgraced and executed father, Yoshitsune made his way north to seek out his older half-brother, Minamoto no Yoritomo. Yoritomo was the last great hope of their clan, a shrewd and calculating politician exiled as a boy, who was now methodically building an army to challenge the ruling Tara clan. When this wild, intense young man appeared before him, claiming to be his long-lost brother, Yoritomo was skeptical, but then he saw Yoshitsune move. He saw him train with the clan's best samurai, dismantling them with an effortless, almost contemptuous ease. His sword style was unlike anything they had ever seen. Fluid, unpredictable, and devastatingly effective. It was the fighting style of a ghost, a demon. Yoritomo, ever the pragmatist, saw not a brother, but an asset, an impossibly potent tool to be aimed at the heart of his enemies. He unleashed Yoshitsune upon the Tara, and in doing so unleashed a legend. This was the era of the Genpei War, a bloody 5-year civil war that tore Japan apart. It was a clash of titans, the established aristocratic Tara clan, who controlled the emperor and the capital, against the rugged provincial Minamoto warriors, hungry for revenge and power. 4 years the war had been a brutal stalemate. Then Yoshitsune arrived, and he didn't just fight battles, he rewrote the very rules of warfare. His first legendary moment came at the Battle of Ichinotani. The Tara had fortified themselves in a seemingly impregnable fortress, backed against the sea with a steep, impassable cliff behind them. No army could attack from the rear. It was considered suicide. But Yoshitsune wasn't a normal commander. He had spent his childhood scrambling up and down the treacherous slopes of Mount Kurama, chasing Tengu through landscapes that would kill a normal man. Looking down that sheer cliff face, he didn't see an obstacle. He saw a highway. While the main Minamoto army prepared for a frontal assault, Yoshitsune led a small, elite force on a long detour to the top of the mountain behind the fort. His own men looked at the drop in horror. They said even a wild boar would hesitate. Yoshitsune, calm and resolute, simply said, "If we are careful, even a horse can make it." He rode his own horse down a test slope, proving it was possible. Then, with the battle raging below, he gave the order. What followed was an act of such audacious insanity it belongs in mythology. Yoshitsune and his samurai charged their warhorses straight down the side of the cliff, a human avalanche of steel and fury, sliding and crashing their way into the completely undefended rear of the Tara camp. The panic was instantaneous and absolute. The Tara, believing they were being attacked by demons from the sky, broke and fled in a terrified mob, straight into the waiting spears of the main Minamoto army. It was a slaughter, and it was a victory born entirely from a Tengu's education. No sane military strategist would have ever conceived it. But Yoshitsune was just getting started. Months later, at the Battle of Yashima, he did it again. The remaining Tara forces had regrouped on an island, their fleet protecting them in the channel. Yoshitsune's army was days away, but he arrived ahead of them with only 150 cavalry. He saw the Tara were overconfident, their defenses lax, so he used a classic Tengu tactic, illusion. He had his men light hundreds of bonfires on the shore, making it look like a massive army had arrived. He had them raise Minamoto banners all across the hills. The Tara, seeing the sea of flames and flags, panicked once more. They scrambled onto their ships to flee, thinking they were about to be overwhelmed. In that moment of chaos, Yoshitsun and his tiny force charged straight into the surf, riding their horses into the sea, firing arrows and cutting down the confused Terra warriors as they tried to escape. He turned 150 men into an army through pure, unadulterated bluff and psychological warfare. It was the cunning of a fox spirit, the trickery of a goblin. The end came at the naval battle of Dan no Yura. This was the Terra's last stand. The entire Terra fleet, carrying the child Emperor Antoku and the sacred imperial regalia, faced off against the Minamoto fleet, commanded by Yoshitsun. At first, the battle favored the Terra, their experienced sailors using the tides to their advantage. But Yoshitsun again did the unthinkable. The unspoken rule of samurai naval combat was to target the ships and the warriors, but to never target the non-combatant rowers. It was a matter of honor. Yoshitsun had no such human constraints. His Tengu masters had taught him one thing above all: victory. He ordered his archers to ignore the samurai in their fancy armor, and instead rain arrows down upon the defenseless men rowing the Terra ships. The tactic was brutally effective. The Terra ships, their rowers dead and dying, lost all maneuverability. They became helpless, drifting targets. The tide shifted, and the Minamoto fleet closed in for the kill. Seeing that all was lost, the Terra nobles began to commit ritual suicide, plunging into the waves rather than face capture. The grandmother of the 8-year-old emperor, holding him in her arms, told him their palace was at the bottom of the sea, and leaped into the blood-red water, taking the boy emperor and the sacred sword Kusanagi with her. The Terra clan was utterly annihilated. The Jinpei War was over. Minamoto no Yoshitsun, the boy from the mountain, had almost single-handedly won his brother an empire. He was now the most famous man in Japan. His name was spoken with awe in every corner of the country. Songs were sung of his brilliance, his courage, his seemingly divine protection on the battlefield. He was a living god of war. And his brother, the cold, calculating Yoritamo in his distant capital of Kamakura, heard the songs. He heard the whispers of awe, and he felt a cold dread creep into his heart. The tool he had unleashed had become a legend, and legends are dangerous. They inspire loyalty. They command respect. They cast very, very long shadows. While Yoshitsun was winning glory on the battlefield, Yoritama was consolidating power through politics. And he saw his younger brother's meteoric rise not as a family triumph, but as a direct threat. This was the lesson the Tengu had failed to teach. Yoshitsun, pure in his warrior's code, assumed his loyalty and his victories were all that mattered. He couldn't comprehend the venomous sting of jealousy. He didn't understand that in the world of men, being too successful, too popular, could be a death sentence. When the retired emperor, hoping to check Yoritama's growing power, offered Yoshitsun titles and positions at court, Yoshitsun accepted them gratefully, thinking it an honor for the whole clan. He didn't ask his brother's permission. He didn't realize that in Yoritama's eyes, this was not an honor, it was an act of treason. It was a sign that Yoshitsun was building his own power base, independent of the clan leader. The hero had conquered his enemies, only to create a new one where he least expected it. He had faced down armies and stormed impossible fortresses, but he was utterly unprepared for the subtle political knives being sharpened in the shadows of his own family. Yoshitsun had won the war for the Minamoto, solidifying his legend as the greatest samurai of his age. He had proven the Tengu's teachings were superior to any on earth. But as he rode towards the capital, expecting a hero's welcome, a victory order was being replaced by an arrest warrant, and the brother he had just made shogun was now signing his death sentence. The journey to the capital was meant to be a victory lap, a triumphant procession for the man who had delivered Japan into his brother's hands. But the winds of fortune are fickle, and the whispers of courtiers are sharper than any sword. Minamoto no Yoshitsun, the peerless warrior, the student of the Tengu king, was about to learn a lesson that no mountain demon could ever teach him. The most dangerous enemy is not the one you face on the battlefield, but the one who shares your blood. His brother Yoritamo, now the undisputed ruler, sat in his court not with pride, but with a cold, creeping dread. He hadn't seen a victorious general. He'd seen a rival. He heard the songs the people sang of Yoshitsun's brilliance, of his almost supernatural speed and strategy. He saw the loyalty in the eyes of the samurai who fought beside him, and he realized that the very qualities that had won him the war, Yoshitsune's genius, his charisma, his otherworldly skill, were the same qualities that could one day unseat him. Yoritama was a politician, a builder of systems. Yoshitsune was a force of nature, an untamable storm. And you cannot build a house in the middle of a hurricane. The fear curdled into paranoia. Every cheer for Yoshitsune was a dagger in Yoritama's ear. Every tale of his battlefield prowess was proof of a power that Yoritama himself could never wield. This wasn't just sibling rivalry. It was a fundamental clash of worlds. Yoritama, the man of order and law, versus Yoshitsune, the man who communed with spirits and moved like a ghost. The court, sensing the shift in the wind, began to poison Yoritama's mind. They whispered that Yoshitsune was arrogant, that he acted without orders, that his ambition knew no bounds. They played on Yoritama's deepest insecurities, framing Yoshitsune's Tengu-taught abilities not as a gift, but as a threat. How can you trust a man who learned his art from goblins? How can you control a warrior who thinks like a demon? And so the order was given. The hero was declared a traitor. The savior was branded an outlaw. Yoshitsune, arriving at the gates of the capital, was denied entry. The man who had just won an entire country was now a man without a home, hunted by the very brother he had fought to empower. This is where the story of Yoshitsune becomes a profound commentary on the nature of the Tengu themselves. They had given him everything he needed to be the perfect warrior. They taught him to read the flow of battle like a river, to strike with the speed of a falcon, to endure hardships that would break ordinary men. They forged him into a living weapon, but they had neglected one crucial part of his education: humanity. The Tengu are creatures of the mountains, of ancient forests and forgotten peaks. They exist outside the complex web of human society, with its delicate hierarchies, its petty jealousies, its political machinations. They understand power, pride, and skill. They do not understand betrayal born of fear, or the subtle poison of a well-placed rumor. They taught Yoshitsune how to defeat an army, but not how to navigate a royal court. They gave him the strength of a demon, but it blinded him to the weakness of men, especially the weakness of his own brother. In a way, Yoshitsune's downfall was the ultimate lesson from his Tengu masters. For the Tengu are not benevolent sages. They are forces of disruption. They are embodiments of pride, of the ego that leads to ruin. In Buddhist lore, the realm of the Tengu, or Tengudo, is a place for those who are arrogant in life, especially priests or samurai who misuse their knowledge and power. They are trapped in a state of being, powerful yet unable to achieve enlightenment, forever consumed by the very pride that defined them. Did Sojobo, the king of the Tengu, know this would happen? Did he look at the young, determined boy and see not just a warrior, but a perfect vessel for tragedy? A perfect example of the Tengu's creed? Perhaps the lesson wasn't just about swordsmanship. Perhaps the true lesson was that supernatural power is no shield against human nature, that you can be the greatest fighter in the world and still be brought low by a whisper. Yoshitsune, in his brilliance, had become arrogant. He believed his victories spoke for themselves. He was a warrior, not a politician, and he disdained the games of court. This was the fatal flaw, the crack in his armor, a flaw that was itself a reflection of the Tengu spirit. Now a fugitive, Yoshitsune fled with a handful of his most loyal followers, most famously the giant warrior monk, Saito Mizushibo Benkei. The tales of their escape are legends in their own right, a desperate hunted flight across the country they had just liberated. They used disguises, fought off ambushes, and relied on the kindness of strangers who still saw Yoshitsune as a hero. But for every person who helped them, there were 10 more willing to sell them out for the shogun's reward. The entire nation became a trap. Every mountain pass, every river crossing, every friendly-looking temple could hide an assassin. And through it all, one has to wonder what Yoshitsune was thinking. As he hid in cold forests, the same kind of forests where he had once trained with Sojobo, did he feel abandoned by his monstrous teachers? Or did he finally understand the cruel irony of their gift? They had made him too great for the world. His power, his legend, had become a fire so bright that his own brother could only see the need to extinguish it. This tragic arc reveals the darker side of the Tengu myth. They are not simply wise old birdmen who teach secrets to worthy heroes. They are tricksters. Their knowledge is a poison chalice. They represent the danger of seeking power outside the natural order. To learn from a Tengu is to invite chaos into your life, to mark yourself as other. Yoshitsun was no longer just a Minamoto samurai. He was the Tengu's student, a figure of awe and suspicion. His legend was inseparable from them, and that connection which gave him his strength also sealed his fate. This is a recurring theme in Japanese folklore. The concept of kamikakushi, meaning hidden by the gods or spirited away, often involved Tengu. Children who wandered too far into the woods might be taken by a Tengu. Sometimes they returned days or years later, dazed and changed, having lost all sense of time. Other times they were never seen again. While Yoshitsun wasn't literally spirited away as a child, his training with the Tengu was a form of kamikakushi. He went into the mountains a boy and emerged something more, and something less than human. He had been taken from the normal course of his life and set on a path of spectacular glory, and even more spectacular ruin. He was the ultimate cautionary tale, a man who flew too close to the sun, not on wings of wax and feathers, but on the dark, feathered wings of the Tengu. For 2 years, he and his followers evaded Yoritomo's grasp, a testament to the skills he had learned. But the net was closing. His allies were killed or forced to abandon him. His legend began to fade from that of a hero to that of a desperate fugitive. He was finally cornered in the north of Japan, taking refuge in the castle of a family who owed him their loyalty. But loyalty is a fragile currency when a shogun's army is at your gate. The lord of the castle, fearing Yoritomo's wrath, betrayed him. As the shogun's forces stormed the walls, Yoshitsun, the greatest warrior Japan had ever known, the man who could leap an impossible distance between ships, the student of the king of goblins, found himself in a single room with his family surrounded with no escape. The end was here, and his Tengu masters were nowhere to be seen. The great warrior stood in the flickering candlelight, the shouts of his brother's army echoing outside the thin walls of his last refuge. This was not the glorious end a hero of his stature deserved, not in a blaze of battlefield glory, but cornered like an animal. For all his supernatural speed, for all the secret arts taught to him in the misty peaks of Mount Kurama, he could not outrun fate. He could not outrun the jealousy of a brother who sat on a throne he helped him win. Outside, the last of his loyal retainers fought and died, their screams a testament to their devotion. Among them was the giant Benkei, the warrior monk who had once been his enemy and became his most steadfast friend. Benkei stood alone on the bridge leading to the residence, a living wall of flesh and steel. Arrows rained down on him, turning him into a human pincushion, but he did not fall. He stood there, defiant, his feet planted, his massive naginata scything through any soldier foolish enough to charge. He was buying his master time. Time for what? Not for an escape. There was no escape. He was buying him time for an honorable death. Inside, Yoshitsun knew what he had to do. Capture meant humiliation. It meant being paraded before the brother who had betrayed him. It meant an end without dignity. That was a fate worse than any death. And so, with a calm he hadn't felt in months, he prepared for the final ritual. He composed a death poem, took up the short blade, and in an act of ultimate samurai resolve, committed seppuku, ensuring his spirit would remain pure and unbroken, even as his body fell. When the soldiers, emboldened by Benkei's eventual stillness, finally stormed the room, they found only silence and the body of a legend who had chosen his own end. But the question hangs in the air, a ghost in the annals of history. Where were his masters? Where were the Tengu? The king of goblins, Sojobo, who had seen such promise in the young boy, who had gifted him the secrets of the sword and the wind. Did they simply abandon their greatest student to his fate? Some say they did. That the laws of the spirit world forbade them from interfering so directly in the world of men. That their role was to teach, to guide, but that the path and its end must be walked by the mortal alone. Others whisper a different story. They say the Tengu did not abandon him at all. That as his spirit left his body, they were there waiting. They swooped down from their mountain peaks and carried his soul away, not to the Buddhist afterlife, but back to the forests and the crags he knew as a child. In this version of the tale, Yoshitsun's death wasn't an end. It was a transformation. The greatest human student of the Tengu became one of them. His vengeful spirit, now armed with supernatural power, would go on to haunt his enemies, a new powerful goblin taking his place among the mountain hierarchy. This idea of a human ascending to the level of a Tengu wasn't just a fantasy tacked onto a hero's story. It was deeply woven into the very fabric of how Japan's perception of these creatures was about to change. Because while Yoshitsune was learning from the Tengu, another group of humans was actively trying to become like them. They were the Yamabushi, the mountain prostrators. These were real-life warrior monks, mystics, and ascetics who saw the mountains as their monastery. They were followers of a unique, syncretic faith called Shugendo, a blend of traditional Shintoism, esoteric Buddhism, and folk magic. For the Yamabushi, the untamed wilderness was the ultimate place to find enlightenment and supernatural power. They subjected themselves to brutal tests of endurance, standing under freezing waterfalls, fasting for days, and meditating on treacherous cliffs. They were tough, mysterious figures believed to possess abilities far beyond those of ordinary men. Healing, exorcism, and even flight. And as these Yamabushi wandered the remote mountains, who else would they encounter but the original masters of those peaks? The Tengu. The lines began to blur. Did the Yamabushi model themselves after the Tengu? Or did the legends of the Tengu begin to absorb the characteristics of the Yamabushi? The answer is yes. Look at the most common image of a Tengu today. Not the early birdman, the Karasu Tengu, but the Dai Tengu, the greater Tengu. He has a long, prominent nose, a fierce, often red, face, and he carries a fan made of feathers that can create hurricane-force winds. He often wears the robes and small black cap of a priest. This entire image is a direct copy of the Yamabushi ascetic. The small black cap, the token, was a real piece of headwear worn by the Yamabushi. The feathered fan, or hauchua, was a ritual item they carried. Even the long nose, the most famous feature, is thought by some scholars to be an exaggeration of foreign priests who came to Japan, or perhaps a way to de-emphasize the bird-like beak while still keeping a non-human facial feature. Suddenly, the Tengu weren't just monsters anymore. They were becoming conflated with these incredibly powerful, enlightened human mystics. They began to be seen not just as goblins, but as kami, as gods and protectors of the sacred mountains. They were manifestations of the mountain's wild spirit. This new role came with a new purpose. The Tengu became guardians of the Buddhist Dharma, or law. They were now divine judges. And their favorite targets: arrogant, corrupt, or hypocritical Buddhist priests. In the medieval period, many Buddhist temples grew incredibly wealthy and powerful. The monks living in them were often more concerned with politics and money than with enlightenment. To the Tengu, who embodied the pure, hard-won wisdom of the mountains, this was an insult, and they would not let it stand. Stories abound of proud priests being taught brutal lessons in humility by the Tengu. One tale speaks of a high-ranking priest who boasted of his deep understanding of the scriptures. One night, a Tengu appeared and challenged him to a debate. The priest, confident in his knowledge, accepted. But the Tengu's questions were strange and impenetrable, twisting logic and reality until the priest was left sputtering, his intellectual pride shattered. As his punishment, the Tengu snatched him up and left him tied to the very top of a colossal cedar tree, where he remained for 3 days, exposed to the elements, forced to contemplate his own insignificance in the face of the vast, wild world, a world he had forgotten in his comfortable temple. When he was finally rescued, he was a changed man, humbled and truly wise for the first time. This is the world of the Tengu-do, the realm of the Tengu. It was believed that a priest who died with a heart full of pride, who had broken his vows or used his position for personal gain, would not be properly reincarnated. Instead, he would fall into the Tengu-do, reborn as a Tengu himself. It was a specific kind of hell reserved for the spiritually arrogant. This explains why Tengu were so often depicted in priestly garb, because in a way they were fallen priests, forever bound to punish the same sins they had once committed. They understood the Dharma better than anyone, and were therefore the perfect, merciless enforcers of its laws. They were no longer simple monsters kidnapping children. They were now a complex moral force, a necessary evil that kept the human world spiritually in check. They were the personification of the idea that with great knowledge comes great responsibility, and that pride, especially spiritual pride, always comes before a fall, sometimes from the top of a very, very tall tree. And this fall from grace wasn't just a metaphor. It was a literal, terrifying reality for those who dared to challenge the mountain spirits. Imagine a renowned priest, famous throughout the provinces for his piety and wisdom. He travels to a remote mountain temple, his heart swelling not with humility, but with a smug satisfaction at his own spiritual achievements. As he walks the ancient stone path, he might notice the wind picking up, rustling the leaves in a strange, almost conversational way. A shadow might flicker at the edge of his vision, too large for a bird, too quick for a man. He dismisses it. Arrogance is a thick blindfold. That night, sleeping in the temple, he's plagued by nightmares. He dreams of being judged by a council of stern, bird-faced figures, their eyes glowing like embers in the dark. They whisper his secret vanities, his hidden desires for fame and recognition, broadcasting them for all the spirits of the forest to hear. He wakes in a cold sweat, the whisper still echoing in his ears. The next day, he tries to preach to the local monks, but his words come out as gibberish, the squawking of a crow. His sacred texts, when he opens them, are filled with blank pages. He is tormented, humiliated, and driven from the mountain, his spiritual pride shattered into a million pieces. He returns to the world a broken man, a living warning against the very sin that created the Tengu in the first place. This was the Tengu's role as celestial police, the guardians against hubris. But this is where their story takes a fascinating and, frankly, a much more dangerous turn. Because while they punish the proud, they also possess the very knowledge and power that created that pride. They were masters of swordsmanship, strategy, and esoteric arts. And sometimes, just sometimes, they were willing to teach. This duality, the monster and the mentor, is perfectly captured in one of Japan's most legendary tales. The story of the great warrior, Minamoto no Yoshitsune. Yoshitsune was a child of tragedy. His father was killed in a clan war, and as a young boy he was exiled to a monastery on Mount Kurama, north of Kyoto. He was supposed to live out his days as a monk, his warrior bloodline forgotten. But destiny, as it often does, had other plans. The boy was filled with a burning desire for vengeance and to restore his family's honor. But he was just a boy, secluded in a temple. How could he possibly become a warrior capable of challenging the most powerful samurai in the land? The answer, according to legend, lived deeper in the mountain's forests. The king of the Tengu himself, the mighty Sojobo. Sojobo was a Dai Tengu of immense power, often depicted with a fantastically long nose, flowing white hair, and an aura of ancient authority. He ruled over all the lesser Tengu of Mount Kurama. One evening, the young Yoshitsune, practicing with a wooden sword against a tree, was watched by this very creature. Sojobo saw not a boy monk, but the flickering flame of a future legend. He saw a vessel worthy of the Tengu's secret knowledge. And so the training began. Every night, Yoshitsune would sneak away from the monastery and venture into the Sojobo, the Valley of the King. There, under the moonlight, he was taught by the Tengu. This was no ordinary martial arts instruction. His sparring partners were the fierce Karasu Tengu, who moved with supernatural speed and agility. They taught him how to leap from tree to tree, to become a shadow in the forest, to fight with a ferocity that bordered on the inhuman. Sojobo himself took on the role of master sensei. He didn't just teach Yoshitsune how to swing a sword, he taught him the art of war. He imparted secret strategies, tactics of deception, and a profound understanding of battlefield psychology. He was forging not just a swordsman but a commander. The legends say that the skills Yoshitsune learned were so advanced, so otherworldly, that they could only have come from a non-human source. He learned a fighting style that was fluid, acrobatic, and utterly unpredictable, a stark contrast to the more rigid, formal styles of the samurai he would one day face. This training transformed the exiled boy into one of the most brilliant and feared military geniuses in Japanese history. When he finally left Mount Kurama, he was no longer just a boy seeking revenge. He was a warrior touched by the supernatural, armed with the secret arts of the mountain goblins. His subsequent victories on the battlefield were so astonishing, so against the odds, that people whispered it wasn't just his skill, but the magic of the Tengu that guided his blade. But the Tengu's interactions with humanity weren't always so productive. For every Yoshitsune they trained, there were 1,000 ordinary people they simply chose to mess with. And their favorite, most terrifying pastime was a phenomenon known as kamikakushi, literally, hidden by the gods, but more accurately, spirited away. This was the ancient explanation for sudden, inexplicable disappearances. A child playing in the woods at dusk, a woodcutter who fails to return from the mountain, The culprit was the Tengu. They would snatch people away, not always out of malice, but sometimes out of sheer curiosity or a desire for a plaything. Victims who returned, if they returned at all, would often have no memory of where they'd been. Days, months, or even years might have passed for them in the blink of an eye. Some returned dazed and confused, telling impossible stories of flying through the air or feasting in palaces hidden inside ancient trees. Others, tragically, were returned insane, their minds shattered by a brief glimpse into the alien world of the spirits. And some were found as skeletons, left in a remote ravine years later. This was the terrifying power of the Tengu. The ability to simply pluck you out of reality, to erase you from the world for a while, and then drop you back forever changed. It's a primal fear, the idea that the world you know is thin, and something ancient and powerful can reach through and take you at any moment. When they weren't abducting people, they were masters of illusion and psychological warfare. A Tengu might make a traveler walk in circles for hours, convinced they are on a straight path. They could fill a forest with phantom sounds, the clang of swords, the roar of a non-existent waterfall, or the chilling laughter of a child. They love to humiliate arrogant individuals, using their powers of illusion to make a powerful lord see a pile of dung as a delectable rice cake, only revealing the truth after he'd taken a hearty bite. And the source of many of these fantastic powers was a single iconic object, the hauchua or feather fan. This wasn't just an accessory. In the hands of a Dai Tengu, this fan was a weapon of immense magical potential. With a single wave, a Tengu could summon hurricane-force winds, capable of tearing trees from the earth. They could use it to magically shrink or, more famously, grow a person's nose to comical or terrifying lengths. It was an instrument of their power, a symbol of their command over the very air and, to some extent, reality itself. So we have this incredibly complex picture emerging. They are punishers of the proud, yet were born of that same pride. They are terrifying abductors who spirit people away from reality, yet they are also the legendary teachers who forged Japan's greatest heroes. They are malevolent tricksters and divine guardians, monsters and mentors. The Tengu are not a simple evil. They are a force of nature, as unpredictable and as dangerous as the mountains they call home. They operate on a logic that is entirely their own, a set of rules and a code of honor that humans can only guess at. To encounter one was to stand at a crossroads between enlightenment and insanity, between legendary skill and a terrifying unexplained disappearance. This crossroads was a very real place for many in feudal Japan, a literal and metaphorical line drawn at the edge of the forest. To step across it was to enter a domain where the rules of man no longer applied. And this is where we find one of the most chilling concepts associated with the Tengu, the phenomenon known as kamikakushi. The term translates roughly to hidden by the gods, or more ominously, spirited away. All across Japan for centuries there were stories. A child playing at the edge of the woods at dusk, gone in the blink of an eye. A woodcutter, familiar with every twist and turn of the mountain path, who simply vanishes between one village and the next. No tracks, no witnesses, just an unnerving silent emptiness where a person used to be. While other yokai and kami were sometimes blamed, the prime suspects in mountainous regions were always the Tengu. They were seen as the ultimate kidnappers, snatching humans away for reasons that were terrifyingly opaque. Were they taking them as servants, as students, or perhaps for something far worse? The terror of kamikakushi wasn't just in the loss, but in the not knowing. It was a complete and total erasure from the known world. Occasionally, the spirited away would return. They might reappear a day later, confused and disoriented, with no memory of what happened, convinced only minutes had passed. More disturbingly, they might return years, even decades later, not having aged a single day. They would come back with strange abilities, a sudden savant-like understanding of nature, the ability to speak to birds, or an uncanny skill with a sword. When pressed, they would describe a world inside the mountain, a place of towering cedar trees that touched the sky, of strange rituals and endless, grueling training sessions under the watchful eye of a long-nosed master. They spoke of a life with the Tengu, but this return was rarely a happy one. The world they had left behind had moved on. Their families were gone, their homes belonged to others. They were now outsiders, touched by something otherworldly and frightening. Their new skills, gifted to them by the Tengu, often felt less like a blessing and more like a brand, marking them as separate from humanity. The knowledge they gained came at the cost of everything they had ever known. This was the Tengu's bargain, a transaction where the terms were never fully explained. You might receive the secrets of the universe, but lose your place within it. Think back to the legendary warrior, Minamoto no Yoshitsen, trained by the Tengu king Sojobo. His skills were supernatural, his battlefield prowess unmatched. He was one of the greatest military geniuses in Japanese history, and his life ended in tragedy. Betrayed by his own brother, hunted as a fugitive, he was forced to take his own life at the age of 30. One has to wonder, was this part of the price? Did the Tengu's training instill in him a pride, a recklessness, a belief in his own invincibility that ultimately led to his downfall? The Tengu give, but they also take. Their gifts are often poisoned, their lessons double-edged. They teach you how to fly, but they don't warn you about the fall. This influence wasn't limited to isolated individuals. The Tengu's meddling began to be seen on a much grander scale. During periods of intense civil war and political turmoil in Japan, the Tengu were often cast as spectral instigators, fanning the flames of conflict. Their inherent pride and love of chaos made them the perfect agents of discord. A samurai lord, filled with ambition and a thirst for power, might suddenly find his path cleared, his rivals falling to misfortune or making foolish mistakes. Was it luck? Or was it a Tengu whispering in his ear during a dream, promising him glory in exchange for a little bit of chaos? They were said to be masters of illusion, capable of creating phantom armies to frighten one side or bolster the morale of another. Chronicles from the medieval period sometimes speak of strange omens preceding a major battle, unnatural weather, flocks of birds behaving erratically, or the sound of a conch shell horn echoing from an empty mountain peak. These were seen as signs of Tengu interference. They weren't picking a side to win, they were picking a side to prolong the fight. To them, human conflict was a form of high entertainment, a grand theatrical performance of pride, honor, and folly. They were the unseen audience and sometimes the unseen directors. This idea gave rise to a specific term, the Tengu-do or the Tengu realm. It wasn't just a physical place but a state of being. It was believed that samurai who died with excessive pride, arrogance, or a lust for power, instead of finding peace or a place in a Buddhist paradise, would fall into the Tengu-do. They would be reborn as Tengu themselves, doomed to an eternity of perpetuating the very same conflicts that defined their mortal lives. It was a grim warning. A life dedicated solely to martial glory and self-importance was a life on the path to becoming a monster. The greatest swordsmen, the most brilliant strategists, if they lacked humility and compassion, were merely candidates for the Tengu's ranks. This belief served a powerful social function. It was a check on the warrior class, a reminder that their skills and their power came with a profound responsibility. To abuse that power was to risk not just a dishonorable death, but a monstrous eternity. The Tengu became a symbol of corrupted power, of knowledge without wisdom, and of strength without restraint. They were the ultimate cautionary tale for a society built on the edge of a sword. But the Tengu's meddling went even deeper than the affairs of warriors and lords. They began to see a rival for the hearts and minds of the Japanese people. A new system of belief was spreading, one that preached humility, compassion, and the abandonment of ego, everything the Tengu stood against. This new power was Buddhism. The serene monks, the sacred sutras, the promises of enlightenment and nirvana, all represented a direct challenge to the wild, chaotic, and prideful domain of the mountain goblins. The Tengu, who saw themselves as the ancient masters of the mountains and the true holders of deep, esoteric knowledge, looked upon these new teachings with utter contempt. They saw it as a lie, a tranquilizer for the human spirit, designed to rob them of their ambition and their fire. And so, the Tengu began to turn their considerable powers of trickery, illusion, and psychological warfare against the institutions of Buddhism itself. They would not stand by and watch their world be paved over with temples and prayers. They had humbled samurai and spirited away children. They had played games with the fate of nations. But their greatest and most audacious target was yet to come. They were about to declare war on heaven itself. And this wasn't just a metaphor. It wasn't a symbolic rebellion against religious authority. This was a literal, planned cosmic insurrection. The Tengu, in their infinite arrogance, looked at the celestial bureaucracy, at the pantheon of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, and thought, we can do better. We can take their place. This was the pinnacle of their pride, the ultimate expression of Ma, the Buddhist concept of the demonic obstacle to enlightenment. To understand how they could even conceive of such a thing, you have to understand the world they lived in. Japan in the 12th century was gripped by a pervasive deep-seated anxiety. A prophecy, originating from the Buddha himself, was coming to pass. It was the beginning of a terrifying new era known as Mappo, the age of Dharma decline. The Buddhist teachings, it was said, would slowly lose their power over a series of millennia. The first 1,000 years were the age of true law. The second 1,000, the age of copied law. But now they were entering the final 10,000-year-long age of decay. An age where humanity's capacity for enlightenment would wither and die, where faith would crumble, where society would descend into chaos, and where the gods themselves would seem distant, perhaps even powerless. And to the people on the ground, it certainly looked that way. The imperial court was a snake pit of conspiracies. Powerful warrior clans, the Taira and the Minamoto, were circling each other like wolves, their swords hungry for blood. The great monasteries, meant to be sanctuaries of peace, had become private fortresses with their own warrior monks, waging holy wars against one another. The world felt like it was coming apart at the seams, and in this spiritual power vacuum, the Tengu saw their opportunity. If the gods were losing their grip, then someone had to take the reins. And who better than them? They were the masters of chaos, the whisperers in the ears of the powerful, the shadow puppeteers of human ambition. The grand plan was hatched in the dark peaks of their mountain kingdoms. The most powerful Tengu in Japan, the 8 great Dai Tengu, including the legendary Sojobo of Mount Kurama, convened a council of war. Their strategy was as brilliant as it was diabolical. They wouldn't launch a frontal assault on the heavens. That was crude. That was foolish. Instead, they would use humanity as their weapon. They would orchestrate the greatest civil war Japan had ever seen. A conflict so bloody and so all-consuming that it would tear the country to pieces. In the ashes of that war, Buddhism would be extinguished. The temples would be burned, the sutras lost, the priests scattered. The people, desperate and broken, would have no one left to pray to. And then the Tengu would descend from their mountains, not as tricksters but as new gods. They would become the new lords of Japan. To set this great fire, they needed a spark. A very specific, very powerful, very human spark. They needed a soul consumed by hatred, a spirit with a legitimate claim to power and a burning desire for vengeance. And they found the perfect candidate in a man named Sutoku. He wasn't just any man. He was Emperor Sutoku. He had sat on the chrysanthemum throne, the divine ruler of Japan. But court intrigue is a vicious game. He was forced to abdicate by his own father. His own son passed over for the throne in favor of his brother. Sutoku, feeling betrayed and humiliated, attempted to seize back power in a short, bloody conflict known as the Hagen Rebellion. He failed. His allies were executed, and he was exiled to a remote province, condemned to live out his days as a prisoner. In his exile, Sutoku tried to find solace in faith. He painstakingly copied sacred sutras, pouring his grief and regret onto the page. He sent these copies to the court in Kyoto, a humble offering to be dedicated at a temple. But the court, fearing the scrolls were cursed, refused the gift. They sent them back. This was the final straw. The rejection shattered what little peace Sutoku had found. The story goes that he bit his own tongue, and with his own blood wrote a new curse upon the scrolls. "I will become a great demon of Japan," he wrote. "I will overthrow the emperor and make the people suffer. I will cast this country into hell." He then cast the sacred texts into the sea. His hair and fingernails grew long. His face twisted into a monstrous visage, and when he finally died, he died not as a man, but as a promise of pure, unadulterated vengeance. He had become an onryo, a wrathful ghost, one of the most powerful and feared entities in Japanese folklore. And the Tengu were waiting. They saw this incandescent ball of pure hatred and recognized it for what it was, the ultimate weapon. They came to his spirit in the underworld. They fanned the flames of his rage, promising him the revenge he craved. They told him his anger was righteous, his betrayal unjust. They offered him power beyond his wildest dreams. They would make him their king. They would transform the ghost of a human emperor into the great Tengu of vengeance. Sutoku the man was gone. In his place rose a demon king, his heart filled with nothing but a burning desire to see the empire that had rejected him drown in a sea of blood. With their new king at the helm, the Tengu army was ready. They were a legion of ancient, powerful beings, masters of illusion and warfare, now united under a single banner of apocalyptic revenge. Their first target was the reigning emperor Go-Shirakawa, Sutoka's own brother. The plan was to possess him, to turn him into their puppet and use his authority to light the fuse of civil war. They descended upon the capital like a plague of shadows. The emperor fell gravely ill, tormented by nightmares and visions. He heard voices in the palace walls, saw demonic faces in the dark corners of his rooms. The court physicians were helpless. The priests and exorcists tried their rites, but the demonic influence was too strong. The Tengu were tightening their grip. The fate of Japan and indeed the heavens hung in the balance. But the gods were not blind. From their celestial planes, the Buddhist pantheon saw the darkness gathering. They saw the Tengu's audacious plot and the monstrous spirit they had unleashed. This was not just a human affair anymore. It was a direct challenge to their authority, a declaration of war on the divine order itself, and they would not let it stand. The call went out. The protectors of the Dharma, the fierce guardian deities, began to stir. Chief among them was Fudomyo, the immovable wisdom king, a being of terrifying appearance, wreathed in flames, holding a sword to cut through illusion and a rope to bind evil. He is the ultimate enforcer, the one you send when diplomacy has failed and only overwhelming righteous force will suffice. The heavens began to muster their own army, not of flesh and blood but of light and power. They chose their own champion on earth, a high priest of immense spiritual power, and through him they would wage their counterattack. The stage was now set for a conflict of unimaginable scale. On one side, an army of mountain demons, led by the vengeful ghost of an emperor, determined to drag the world into a new age of darkness under their rule. On the other, the divine guardians of heaven, preparing to unleash their sacred fury to protect the world of men. The human realm had become the battlefield for a war between gods and monsters, and the first shots were about to be fired. The very soul of Japan was at stake. The sky itself screamed. A wave of pure malice, a tsunami of shrieking hatred, crashed against the sacred mountains. The Onryo, the vengeful dead, were not an army in any recognizable sense. They were a plague of despair given form, a tide of black ink and gnashing teeth that sought to drown the world in its own sorrow. Against this tide stood the Tengu. They did not meet the charge with a roar, but with a profound and terrifying silence. A silence that was the calm at the eye of a hurricane. At their head was Sojobo, his white hair a stark banner against the encroaching darkness. He did not draw his blade. He simply raised his fan, the hauchua, made from the feathers of a divine bird. With a flick of his wrist, a gale erupted. It was not mere wind, it was the breath of the mountain itself, a cleansing force that tore into the front ranks of the Onryo. Spirits that had been solid manifestations of rage were shredded like smoke, their whispers of vengeance silenced by the roar of the heavens. The Karasu Tengu, the crow-billed warriors, descended like a storm of black blades. Their movements were not human. They were the dive of the hawk, the unpredictable flutter of a leaf in the wind, the deadly strike of a serpent. Each cut of their katana was precise, severing not flesh and bone, but the very threads of resentment that bound the Onryo to the mortal plane. Below them, the Konoha Tengu, the lesser goblins, worked in concert. They did not fight with steel, but with the very fabric of reality. They created illusions of serene mountain temples, tricking hordes of spirits into peaceful oblivion. They shifted the earth, opening chasms that swallowed legions of the damned, their shrieks echoing up from the depths. It was a symphony of divine warfare, a perfect fusion of martial prowess and mystical power. For a moment, it seemed the light would hold. The disciplined fury of the Tengu was a bulwark against the chaotic hatred of their foes. But the Onryo were a force of pure emotion, and hatred is a boundless ocean. For every spirit the Tengu vanquished, 10 more clawed their way from the shadows. The sheer, unending pressure began to take its toll. The Onryo's greatest weapon was not their claws or their curses, but their despair. It was a spiritual poison, a psychic miasma that seeped into the air, the water, the very stone of the mountains. A Karasu Tengu, after felling a dozen spirits, would suddenly falter, his mind flooded with the dying screams of the men he had cut down, the bitterness of the women they had wronged. The illusions of the Konoha Tengu began to flicker and warp, the serene temples twisting into charnel houses as the artists themselves were infected by the grief they were trying to quell. The perfect discipline of the Tengu began to fray. Their connection to the natural world, their greatest strength, was becoming their greatest vulnerability. They could feel the mountain groaning under the weight of so much pain. The trees wept a black sap. The streams ran sluggish and foul. The Onryo were not just attacking the Tengu. They were corrupting their home, turning their sanctuary into a mirror of the underworld. Sojobo watched as one of his finest warriors, a veteran of 1,000 years, was overwhelmed. The Crow Tengu cried out, not in pain but in anguish, as the weight of 100 mortal tragedies crushed his spirit. His form flickered, his divine essence sputtering like a dying flame, before he was swarmed and consumed by the tide. This was how they would lose. Not to a superior force but to a superior poison. The Onryo were a sickness, and the soul of Japan was the patient. Sojobo knew that to fight rage with rage was to simply feed the inferno. Steel could not kill a memory. A storm could not banish regret. A new strategy was needed. He closed his eyes, ignoring the cacophony of battle around him, the screams of his dying brethren, the unending wail of the damned. He reached deep past the warrior, past the king, to the core of his being, the Yamabushi ascetic. He began to chant. It started as a low hum, a vibration that seemed to originate from the heart of the mountain itself. It was a sutra, an ancient mantra of purification, the same words whispered by monks under freezing waterfalls and by hermits in secluded caves. It was the sound of discipline, of enlightenment, of the will triumphing over the chaos of emotion. The other Tengu heard it. Through the fog of despair, the sound cut through like a beacon. One by one they joined the chant. The Karasu Tengu's strikes became rhythmic, each slash punctuated by a syllable of power. The Konoha Tengu abandoned their grand illusions and instead began to weave small, intricate patterns of light, mandalas of sacred geometry that pulsed in time with the growing mantra. The effect was immediate and profound. The Onryo recoiled, not from a physical blow, but from the sound itself. To their ears, tuned to the frequency of hatred and revenge, the sound of pure, focused serenity was an agonizing torment. The black miasma of despair began to dissipate, burned away by the light of 1,000 years of spiritual devotion. This was the Tengu's true power. Not the sword, not the wind, not the illusion. It was their unshakable connection to the universal order, their mastery over the self. They were not just warriors. They were living conduits of divine law. Sojobo's voice now boomed like a temple bell, each word a shockwave of purifying energy. You are bound by the past. Your chains are of your own making. Let go of your sorrow and return to the cycle. This world is not yours to haunt. He slammed the butt of his staff into the ground, and a wave of golden light radiated outwards. It did not destroy the Onryo, absolve them. Spirits twisted by decades of bitterness suddenly found peace. The faces of monstrous Hanya demons softened, the agony melting away to reveal the human faces beneath. They looked, not at the Tengu, but up at a light they had long forgotten, and then they dissolved, not into smoke, but into motes of gentle light, their souls finally free to continue their journey. The tide had turned. The horde was breaking, not by force but by salvation. The Tengu pressed their advantage, their chant becoming a triumphant chorus that echoed across the valleys, cleansing the land itself. Victory was within their grasp. But as the last of the lesser spirits faded, a new presence made itself known. The oppressive, chaotic despair of the Onryo was replaced by something far worse. A cold, intelligent, and infinitely ancient malice. The sky did not darken. It seemed to solidify, turning the color of a deep, starless void. From the heart of that void, a voice spoke, and it was not the shriek of a ghost, but the calm, measured tone of a chess master observing the board. Impressive. The voice echoed, not in their ears but directly in their minds. You have taught the dogs a new trick. You have pacified my puppets. But the puppeteer remains. A figure began to descend from the unnatural darkness. It was not a demon of horn and claw, nor a ghost of shadow and spite. It was a man dressed in the immaculate white robes of an onmyoji, a court sorcerer. But no human had ever possessed such an aura. His eyes glowed with the light of dying stars, and the air around him warped, space and time bending to his will. This was no mere collection of grudges. This was a primeval force, a being who remembered the birth of the gods and who viewed them now as children to be disciplined. He had not unleashed the Onryo to destroy the world, but merely to test its defenses. And now the true lesson was about to begin. The king of the Tengu did not descend from his mountain throne with fire and fury. He brought something far more terrifying, a profound and absolute silence. The Onryo, those shrieking avatars of rage, fell quiet. The winds that had carried their whispers ceased to blow. Across the cities, the hum of technology, the constant thrum of human progress began to falter. Lights flickered not from a loss of power, but from a loss of certainty. It was a silence that crept into the heart of the machine, a stillness that questioned the very foundation of the modern world. Sojobo's lesson was not a war, but an audit. He held up a mirror not to individual souls, but to the soul of an entire civilization. The spirits he had unleashed were not his weapons. They were symptoms of a disease. They were the echoes of forgotten promises, the ghosts of bulldozed forests, the specters of polluted rivers. They were the planet's festering wounds given form and voice, and Sojobo was simply the one who had removed the bandages. He didn't need to topple skyscrapers. He simply made people see them. He stripped away the illusion of their permanence. Through his ancient, powerful will, he showed humanity the truth of their creations. He projected visions not of a possible future, but of an inevitable one. People walking through the concrete canyons of their cities would suddenly see them not as triumphs of engineering, but as tombstones of a forgotten earth. They would see vines thick as pythons, crushing the steel skeletons of their buildings. They would see rivers clean and wild, reclaiming the asphalt arteries of their highways. They saw the world not as it was, but as it would be when their fleeting, arrogant moment was over. This was his martial art, the ultimate technique taught not in a secluded dojo, but on a global stage. He was the divine teacher, the stern master, and his lesson was humility. He attacked the one thing that underpinned the modern world: its pride, the belief that humanity had triumphed over nature, that it had tamed the wild and bent the world to its will. Sojobo, with a stillness that was older than mountains, simply showed them that the cage they had built for the world was, in fact, a cage they had built for themselves. And the lock was their own hubris. There was no grand battle. How do you fight a concept? How do you wage war against your own insignificance? The world's leaders convened, its scientists theorized, its armies mobilized, but they were all children swinging sticks at a tidal wave. They were trying to solve a spiritual crisis with material solutions. They looked for an enemy to defeat, a monster to slay, but all they found was a reflection of their own choices staring back at them. The change came not from a government decree or a technological breakthrough. It came from the bottom up. It started with a quiet reverence. People began to walk in the woods again, not for recreation but for pilgrimage. They started listening to the wind, not as weather but as a voice. The stories of the Tengu, once relegated to folklore and entertainment, were spoken with a new gravity. They were no longer just birdmen from the mountains. They were a living metaphor, a reminder that the world was far older, wilder, and more powerful than any human kingdom. Sojobo watched this change. He saw the first seeds of humility begin to sprout in the barren soil of human pride. He saw the fear of the Onryo slowly transform into a respect for that which had been wronged. His goal was never annihilation. It was balance. The world had tilted too far, and he had simply put his hand on the scale. And then, as quietly as it began, the silence receded. The Onryo their purpose served faded back into the memory of the land, their rage soothed not by victory, but by acknowledgement. The visions ceased. The cities returned to their normal hum, but it was a different sound now. It was quieter, less assured. It was the sound of a civilization that had stared into the abyss and realized the abyss was of its own making. Sojobo, the great Tengu, returned to his throne of cedar and stone on Mount Kurama. He had not won a war, for he had never declared one. He had simply taught a lesson that would be passed down not in textbooks, but in the collective subconscious of a species that had been given a second chance. The world had been tested, and for now it had passed. And so, the story of the Tengu comes full circle. From misunderstood demons, feared for their monstrous forms and chaotic power, to tricksters who tested the limits of human arrogance. From stern but wise masters of esoteric arts, training the greatest warriors and mystics, to something more. They became what they always were. A personification of the mountain itself, a symbol of the untamable wild that exists not just in the deep forests, but in the unexplored wilderness of the human heart. The Tengu represent a fundamental truth, that with great power comes the danger of great pride. Whether it's the skill of a swordsman, the knowledge of a scholar, or the technology of a civilization, hubris is the shadow that follows. The Tengu are the guardians who wait within that shadow, ready to remind us of our limits. They are the masters who teach us that true strength is not about dominating nature, but about understanding our place within it. They are not gone. They never will be, as long as there are mountains shrouded in mist and forests deep enough to get lost in. They are in the sudden gust of wind that snatches your hat, a playful reminder of a power you cannot control. They are in the unnerving feeling of being watched when you are alone among ancient trees. They are in the flash of insight that cuts through your pride and forces you to see the world from a new, more humble perspective. The long nose of the Dai Tengu is a symbol of his pride, but it is also a tool. It is a sword that cuts down arrogance. His fan of feathers can stir a tempest, but it can also blow away the fog of ignorance. He is the paradox of the enlightened warrior, the creature that is both beast and sage, demon and god. In our modern world, we seek to demystify everything. We want to map every corner of the globe, explain every phenomenon, and solve every puzzle. But the Tengu remind us that some mysteries are necessary. We need the wild places. We need the shadows. We need to believe that there are things older and wiser than we are, watching from the mountaintops. Because without that awe, without that sliver of fear, without that profound humility, we forget. We forget that we are not masters of this world. We are merely guests. And the hosts have a very long memory. The Tengu are the keepers of that memory. And they are always watching,